Hello and welcome to episode 71 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR. I'm the father of the most beautiful beast, of course, Jerry, my beloved one. And today we have very, very, very exciting news. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the newest member of the Established The Run family. Happy to introduce everyone to our freshly minted Director of Analytics. It is the one and only Mike Leone, aka Two Hats, One Mike. Mike, what's going on? Welcome.
Thank you for that really nice welcome, Adam. I'm really excited to join the talented team here at ETR and to get to work. It's kind of a dream landing this position, so I'm excited.
Yeah, people always ask me, like, Adam, what do you tell, like, when you meet adults, and when you meet people, they ask what you do. I always say, oh yeah, I'm in predictive analytics, right? Because they don't really know what that means, and it sounds fancy. It sounds like I have a real job, but that's actually what Mike does, instead of I'm just pulling it out of my ass. So yeah, very happy to have Mike here. I think super excited by the potential, and also the immediate impact I think Mike will have on our content and our products. Obviously Mike's been a long time winning high stakes DFS player. He's also studied season long a ton. I think relatively rare, Mike, that people use all these like advanced skills like Python and R for strictly fantasy football. Like usually these people are like solving the world's problems, but I'm happy to have someone who is using these skills for something as important as fantasy football. I think complement the strengths that we have on the team already really, really well. So yeah, I don't know. Welcome. Predictive analytics. It's actually a real thing, huh?
It is. And it sounds much better than when I first started just writing blog posts and stuff for fantasy baseball. As you said, those conversations with people explaining what you do, I can make it sound much more prestigious now that I am a director of analytics.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. We'll eventually do a show where we get to know Mike a little better, his background, what director of analytics means, exactly where you guys will see his impact on the site and the content, etc. But for today, we wanted to do kind of a quick deep dive behind our FFPC rankings, talk about some overarching strategy, some quirks to be aware of. And we're going to do this for all our rankings as we move through the summer. If you go to the site, we have rankings available for every kind of format. We're always adding more. So we'll do like kind of an accompaniment podcast, I want to call it, a companion podcast. And this is for FFPC. We'll do one for NFFC, for Best Ball, for two quarterback, for auction, etc. So yeah, just consider this a draft kit companion pod for our FFPC specific rankings. Obviously, Mike, I think pick the right players, right, is what you need to do to win. And that's what people are going to say. And that's kind of like the level one approach. Of course, you need to pick the right players. And that's clearly our main focus. But there's so much more to a fantasy draft than that. I think a strategical element, particularly against tough competition. So there's a strategical element we hope to add here to kind of complement things. But yeah, I mean, pick the right players is not an actual strategy, right? Of course, everybody's trying to just pick the right players.
Yeah, if your only strategy is to pick better players than the rest of the competitors in your league, you're doing the exact same thing they are. They think they're picking better players. You think you're picking better players. And I think with the resources at ETR, with you and Silva, we're putting people in a position to pick those better players. But as you said, it has a ceiling to what that can do for you. And that's where a lot of the stuff I'm going to be working on is intertwining pick the right players with structural drafting and really trying to find that equilibrium to what's the best roster construction, what are some techniques to give your team the most upside necessary to achieve a high standing, while incorporating the fact that obviously we like certain players more than the market or certain players less than the market.
Yeah, for sure. And like, it just cracks me up so much. Like people bury Hinkie for making some bad picks as a GM. Like it's really, really hard to be 100% consistent picking the best players. If you can give yourself a strategy, there's so much more upside to be gained. By the way, before we go any further, I've almost forgot to say our early bird special is in fact live. Includes the draft kit in season and the $25 FFPC coupon, all for $199. Very easily will be our best offer of the season. Won't last long, so head to the site, check it out. All kinds of content schedules on there too. All right, let's get to FFPC. For those guys that don't know, FFPC is a higher stakes season long platform. They run some big, large field GPPs, kind of like DFS, like kind of, relatively small buy-in, 300, $350 or whatever, and huge first place prize. I think 500,000. Kind of like DFS in that it's extremely top heavy, but it's just for season long. And they also have best ball and everything, etc. So yeah, it's an interesting format. The extreme top heavy nature of these large field tournaments, I think, brings in even more strategy into play. But I want to start with something just simpler first, the format. And the format in FFPC is different than most because you only have to start 2 wide receivers. And you don't see that very often in fantasy football these days. The format is quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, 2 flex spots, no quarterback, but 2 flex spots, kicker and defense. And so you get into a spot where at this absurdly deep position like wide receiver, in theory, you only have to start 2 wide receivers. So first of all, Mike, what do you think about that format and how does it affect what our strategy should be when you have double flex, 2 wide receiver as starting requirements?
It definitely changes the wide receiver running back dynamic. As you said, wide receiver is so deep this year, and it becomes even deeper when teams don't feel that pressure to take wide receiver early to fill that third wide receiver spot. And a lot of the conversation nowadays revolves around zero running back. And part of that is you want to kill people in that third wide receiver spot. You really want to bury them because you're taking wide receivers earlier, and you lose some of that edge in this format. So I do think it pushes you to taking running back a little bit earlier than you would in another format, not being forced to start 3 receivers and having a little bit of a reprieve there. And if you hit on multiple early running backs, you can hit them, start them in your flex spot. Another component, which we're going to talk about, is tight end premium, but sort of the combination of tight end premium and the 2 flex spots also allows you to play multiple tight ends. And on a lot of platforms, you really just wouldn't even consider that. So you've already seen in 2 different ways where you can get by without loading up on wide receiver early, which isn't to say that you should avoid wide receivers early, but the dynamic's a little bit different. I do think the FFPC market tends to overreact to that, though. So you end up in this weird middle ground where it's true that the wide receivers are devalued a little bit, but they're almost devalued too much by the market.
Right. Yeah. And we're going to talk about wide receivers more in a second here, but you can still start 4. Like people make, you can only start 2. You only have to start 2, but you can still start 4 wide receivers. So, getting wide receiver depth would certainly be a contrarian strategy, but we'll talk about that more in a second. The biggest scoring quirk that I want to mention, Mike already alluded it to, is 1.5 points PPR for tight end, aka tight end premium. So everybody else gets 1 point per reception. Tight ends get 1.5 points per reception. I think, and I haven't done any data research like Mike has, my initial anecdotal take, what seemed right to me is that people are still overvaluing tight ends, even though it's tight end premium. And people are going absolutely nuts. They are spending more capital than they should at the position. They're bumping tight ends way too far up. I'm curious, Mike, if the research has shown that's the case on tight ends, or am I the donkey for thinking that people are overvaluing tight ends in this format?
I think people might overvalue the fringe tight ends that don't have this huge catch-up side. But up at the top, you look at a guy like Travis Kelce, who caught 97 balls last season. That's like spotting him 8 touchdowns against a wide receiver. And I think when you frame it that way, he only scored 5 touchdowns all season. You spotted him 8. So to me, someone like him, once you get past those early stud running backs in the middle of the first round, he's already an option. Kittle's an option at the 1-2 turn because you get an edge in 2 ways. One, that bonus you get over the wide receivers who aren't getting the extra half point per reception, but within the position itself, because a lot of the tight ends, once you get past the premier ones, don't catch a ton of balls.
Yeah.
The gap between Kelce and an average tight end just grows even wider. Only 12 tight ends caught more than 45 balls last year. So, Kelce between any of those guys, that's a 40 catch difference, which again, that's 20 points. That's 3 touchdowns. You're spotting him versus these other tight ends where he's already killing them across the board. So I do think up top, it makes sense to bump up that first tier tight ends, and really anyone you think has 80 catch upside, I would like to get someone in Evan Silva's top 4 tiers of tight ends. I don't think you can just play that roulette game with cheap tight ends, especially if you're talking about a Football Guys Championship, which is, their most popular contest and what our ranks are tailored after, where it's a very top heavy and you want that upside really across your entire roster.
Yeah. And so my early strategy when I've been doing drafts so far this year has actually been the opposite of what Mike said. And I haven't been doing it on tight end premium, but like I actually think the position is kind of deep, right? Like let me take 3 of Jasicki, Hayden Hurst, Fant, Hawkinson, Goddard, Jarwin, Herndon, Ian Thomas, whichever ones you like. And let me take 3 of them and hope that one goes, full blown Darren Waller for me, And so I think for FFPC, your suggestion is that I need to adjust that, and that's not that viable to take 3 of those late round ones.
I think so, but even like that those guys you mentioned are within like those top 4 tiers, and I do think some of those guys individually will get taken too high, but there is a chance that you take the last of that tier and you're okay. And someone like Hayden Hurst, who you mentioned, Austin Hooper caught 70 balls last year in 13 games for Atlanta. That's an 80 catch upside guy. So you really want that catch upside. And the issue is once you get past those guys you mentioned, the volume is just not there for people. Someone like a Jonnu Smith, who I like, but in this format, I just don't think he's going to see enough targets to rack up the catches to really take advantage of the tight end premium scoring. And where the mistake people make is assuming all tight ends are instantly way better because of tight end premium scoring. No, you need guys who have the potential to catch a lot of balls.
Right. And our rankings on the site reflect that. In the draft kit, we have FFP specific rankings. We also baked in some of the FFPC ADP into our FFPC rankings. Why don't you explain to the people why it's important to be aware of the market and bake in the market somewhat when you're doing rankings for a specific site?
Yeah, it stems a little bit from when we started talking how pick the best players only go so far, right? You need to have a list that really is super actionable draft day. That's what we're trying to create. And it might seem counterintuitive at first to bake in the ADP because a lot of people, their main goal is I want to beat ADP by as much as I can. And why would you bake that in? And one, it's only baked in a little bit. So you're still going to be taking the guys we like more than ADP and avoiding the guys we like less than ADP. But it's, for starters, it's good to account, just have a little bit of humility and realize the market's pretty efficient. It's pretty smart. And if you're way off on a guy, maybe you should dial that back a little bit. So I think that's one reason it makes sense. I think the second reason it makes sense is even if you're right and you're way off on ADP versus these guys and you're right, you still have to operate within the market that you're playing in, or you might end up with a bad team, even having vastly superior rankings. We could see that with if you're playing, now these are for Football Guys Championship, but if you're playing a best ball and you think all these running backs are going too early, but you just don't end up with any of them, well, we know structurally you've built a bad team, even though your rankings and maybe in a vacuum, your players that you took over these running backs were correct. And the third reason I like it is you're trying to build a super team. And a lot of times you run into that dilemma of, do I take the guy I have ranked higher, or do I try to take someone who's got a better ADP and get that guy I like better later? Knowing that we've baked in the ADP already, we've sort of answered that question, and Mike Evans, DJ Moore is a good one where we like DJ Moore a little bit more than Mike Evans, which is contrarian to the market. So if you're in there middle of the third round and you're between the two, we've got Mike Evans a little bit higher, even though DJ Moore is higher in our pure point per reception rankings. And you have the chance, then we're saying take Mike Evans here and maybe you get DJ Moore in the fourth round.
Right. Makes sense. All right. Let's go to the running back market at FFPC. I mean, running backs are going really fast this year in all formats, but even faster in FFPC for some of the reasons that we already mentioned. You only have to start 2 wide receivers. And I also think there's like a cultural issue. A lot of the drafters on FFPC, I think, are more conservative with the way they play. And so they're leaning on running backs with big medium projections in terms of workloads. Like, for example, Melvin Gordon, 27th overall ADP on FFPC. Jonathan Taylor, 33rd. Even guys like Kareem Hunt, 56. Aaron Jones, 18. Austin Eckler, 17. So yeah, what do you think about how the FFPC market is handling running backs? And in a year where everybody is taking running backs so high or prioritizing them so high in the first 3 rounds. Should we be prioritizing them even more in this FFPC format?
Yeah, it's difficult. Some of it I think is an overreaction because last year was, a historically bad year for zero running back. If you look at the top performers, I think some of it, there are some trends that support, being even more for running backs early, which is, one, we've seen more time splits at the running back spot. So anyone who's not in a time split all of a sudden has this ceiling that other guys don't, that becomes really more important. And I also think that limits the amount of, quote unquote, zero RB candidates later that can really hit. There's nothing more frustrating than getting the injury or the situation unfolding that you want only to have your guy split and not really benefit. The amount of league winners out there, I think, has reduced a little bit. Some people might argue that's recency bias, but I think that, and in conjunction with teams passing more and spreading the ball out more, it means there's more wide receivers available later. So it makes sense to value the running backs more early, but the market's gone too far in like these football guys championships, where they're stardom leagues, they're not best ball, and you still have an advantage of taking the elite wide receivers. You still have the advantage of your competitors taking fragile running backs in the second and third round. The thing with FFPC is it's just hard to go like full zero running back. You probably want to get at least one in the first 5 rounds somewhere.
Yeah. And I want to ask you about best ball versus active leagues and how the strategy there is different. But I do want to touch on wide receivers before we do that real quick. And what you mentioned about wide receivers is true. I mean, so many more teams are running 11 personnel with 3 wide receivers on the field as a base. So many more teams are having deep wide receiver cores that are able to contribute, and it's really pushed down. And there's so many fewer running backs with full roles. It's really pushed wide receivers down. Plus, you only have to start 2. So, for example, like Silva has Adam Thielen 23rd overall in his top 150, but FFPC ADP is 43. He has Terry McLaurin 37th overall in his top 150. FFPC ADP is 57. It's just absurd value to be had at wide receiver throughout in this format. And again, you can start 4, and it's full PPR. So if you're in an active league, I think there's at least some case to taking some value in the early rounds at wide receiver. I mean, you could have an absolutely stacked wide receiver core. Then again, you could wait till like 6th, 7th round and have very fine wide receiver core also. So how are we handling wide receivers in this kind of unique FFPC format?
Yeah, so I think if you're picking in the beginning of the draft, that's where you want to be. It's so easy to take that stud running back. But if you're towards the back end of the draft and there's not a running back there you think has elite upside, you can try a zero RB approach. I did a draft with Davis Maddock, the Roto World Rumble, which was 12 experts in an FFPC Football Guys Championship. And from the 11 spot, Devontae Adams fell. And at that point, it was, do we want to take, Kenyon Drake versus Devontae Adams? We took Devontae Adams, Kenyon Drake goes, and then, we think that's too early for Josh Jacobs, Eckler, Nick Chubb, even with knowing that RBs are more valuable in this format. So went George Kittle and then got Amari Cooper in the 3rd round. So you can, when you're starting, when you have to make those start decisions, some of the value of the super deep wide receiver is you can still make up for it by having a much better wide receiver. Whereas when you're playing best ball, you can, and you don't have to choose who you're starting because wide receiver is volatile and you can draft wide receivers in bulk. That advantage of taking a really elite wide receiver early is mitigated a little bit. So that's like the key difference between how you're approaching wide receiver, in my opinion. So if you get at the end of the 1st, 2nd round, I don't mind taking a pretty wide receiver heavy approach. And then at the 3-4 turn, there's a couple running backs out there, depending who you like specifically, but Chris Carson, David Johnson, James Conner, those guys that have the potential to be a really valuable running back that, you're just going to take a chance that they're it and they'll be your RB1.
Right. Yeah. And I'm actually doing a podcast with Corinne tomorrow, and we're going to talk more about zero RB and how to approach it and kind of strategies with RBs this year. You can read his article up on the site right now too about how to approach RB if you want to take a contrarian approach. I'd also say that in active leagues, like a big thing, if you don't prioritize running back early, you're going to need some injuries to happen and you're going to need to be able to pounce on the waiver wire. Whereas in best ball, it's much harder or impossible to do that. Obviously, there's no transaction. So in active leagues, I think it makes more sense to try to say, hey, I'm going to be more aggressive. I'm going to be more active. I'm going to be grinding harder than my opponents. And therefore I have a better chance to find an RB down the line where, high workload running backs have such a higher injury rate than high workload wide receivers. Josh Hermsmeyer's has proved that plenty. So yeah, I think that's another thing to think about whether you're doing best ball versus active.
Just to piggyback on that real quick, when you're playing a regular best ball league, not a tournament, week 1 counts the same as week 16. And some of the idea behind building a 0 RB team, heavy wide receivers, to have just this absurd super team come the playoff weeks. And
Right.
in a Football Guys championship, that's super important to get that upside. In a regular best ball league, that's just weeks 1 through 16. There's no surplus advantage to having your team being better at the end of the year.
Right. Okay, let's get to your article. And Mike did a ton of research about stacking in season long. Obviously, anybody who's listened to me or whatever, we've talked tons about stacking in DFS. I mean, even the most elementary DFS players are stacking now. It's funny, when back in 2014 and 2015, it was like a novel concept to like stack with like more than one pass catcher. And now it's just like so standard. But anyways, Mike did a ton of research through a lot of methods I don't even really understand, but his idea was to examine how and why, if really, stacking works in season long. And so why don't you give the people a general overview of what you did, what the process was, what question you were trying to answer with this stacking in season long question?
The primary question I was trying to answer is, when a quarterback has an above average season, and I developed different benchmarks for that, what is the impact on the pass catchers? Are they following suit? Are they following suit in a meaningful way? And the short answer was yes. Yes, they are. If you look at quarterbacks who, in my article, I described as a medium hit or better, or a big hit, that's roughly 25% of quarterbacks over the last 3 seasons in the top 300 FFPC ADP who have outperformed their ADP expectation by 50 points, and topped at least the median quarterback score. And 25% of QBs, like, it's not like we're whittling down to just the very best QBs. And even with those QBs, their pass catchers, so wide receivers and tight ends that were taken, in the first 18 rounds or so, they exceeded their ADP 71% of the time, which is a pretty big hit rate. If you compare it to all other receivers, they're more closer to 50%. And not only that, but they outperform their ADP expectation by 31 points on average, which is pretty meaningful when the average wide receiver for ADP expectation, of course, is 0. So if you reverse the correlation and you looked at the pass catchers first and broke them up individually instead of as groups, the result was the same. When you had pass catchers that were pretty big hits, roughly 25% of the best pass catchers relative to ADP, the quarterbacks really performed much better than ADP expectation. And it's such a simple concept, the same as it is in DFS. But when an offense has a really good season, everyone's going to benefit. And it sounds like you didn't need all this research to determine that, but it was helpful to put a number on it, because it really sticks in your mind that, okay, if I want to hit my upside in a top heavy league, which basically every fantasy league's top heavy to an extent, why would I make a 3-legged uncorrelated parlay and need to hit a quarterback, receiver, and tight end that aren't linked together in any way, when I could hit a 3-legged correlated parlay by taking a quarterback with his receiver and his tight end?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is fear from people, right? Like, we don't want to take a quarterback and his 2 pass catchers, because if they have a mediocre year, a bad year, like, we're just completely dusted, right? Like, we're going to lose the league. I think your point is that, well, if you don't do something correlated, you're, capping your upside, and your more likely outcome is in like 3rd to 5th place range or something like that, rather than giving yourself a chance to 1st. But I think there's something about people that are just a little bit scared to get all their eggs in one basket, if you know what I mean.
It feels weird, but the median expectation for a league is that you're going to win $0. You're going to finish 6th or 7th out of 12, and you're not going to win anything. So the reward is much more important than the risk in that situation. Now, if these were double up leagues or something, you might have a different answer. It kind of reminds me of, the game show problem where there's 3 doors and you pick door number 1, and then they show you nothing's behind door number 3, and they're like, do you want to switch? And the answer is yes, you want to switch. We know game theory probability says you want to switch, but what you're seeing tangibly, it doesn't feel like you're doing anything, right? It just feels completely random, but you are increasing your expected value. I sort of feel like that's how it is with stacking, where it doesn't feel like, okay, I take Jarvis Landry over Christian Kirk here because I want to stack him with Baker Mayfield and Odell Beckham. It doesn't feel like you're doing anything important, but when you run the math at the end of the day, you are increasing your expected value.
And to be clear, you're not advocating for stacking in season long only in these large field tournaments. You're also advocating for stacking in a standard, like FFPC has standard 12 team leagues. You can just play. It's not a tournament. You can just play like a standard fantasy. You're advocating for stacking in those formats too.
I think so. I really, because even a 12 team league, pays out maybe 2 or 3 spots. It's still top heavy. And I think people need to realize that still counts as top heavy, and they should be stacking. And it is hard at times to actionably do it, especially because we're generally taking the pass catchers before the quarterback. So, but you can think ahead. There's a lot of stackable quarterbacks that are going really late. And I think quarterbacks in FFPC, if you're playing in a Football Guys championship, you should generally only be taking 1 quarterback, max 2 quarterbacks, because you want to fill your bench spots with upside guys at the skill positions. And as a result, that Roto World Rumble draft I did, Ben Roethlisberger didn't get drafted. Baker Mayfield won in the 19th round. Guys like, I think Jared Goff might not have gone drafted. Matt Ryan went in the 15th round. So there are guys you can take earlier knowing that you're going to have chances to stack. We like Juju Smith-Schuster relative to ADP. I know people are really high on Deontay Johnson. There's Jarvis Landry is one of our favorite targets. You can pair him with Baker Light. There's a lot of opportunities to be thinking about it early in the draft without sacrificing, that you're moving up too many spots to take these guys.
All right, perfect. Anything else you want to say specific to FFPC and the rankings we have on the site for FFPC before we get out of here?
Just note with quarterback, best ball, and Football Guys Championship is completely different. You can wait a long time in the Football Guys Championship because people know you're taking 1 or 2, but when you're playing best ball and you're supposed to take 3 when there's 28 rounds, the scarcity changes and the quarterbacks are going to go a lot earlier.
All right. We've said it all. We will be back for more companion pods as the summer moves along to go with all of our rankings. In the meantime, take a minute to follow Mike on Twitter at 2hats1mike. I am going to coach him away from talking about sports cards and Bills fans jumping off of tables and stuff like that. You can drop a note in the reviews of this pod if you want. Welcome, Mike, to the team. Any other things people can find you, Mike? Are you on Instagram or anything like that? I am not.
I have it, but I don't use it. Mostly I'm looking forward to the Adam Levitan Twitter classroom breakdown, the full undressing that I'm going to receive.
Oh, people are going to ask what your Twitter name is at 2hats1mike. You better tell them where that came from. Nobody's going to have any idea.
That stems from a FanDuel Fantasy Baseball live final where I may have overindulged in the open bar and stolen a couple of the free hats they gave out and was wearing them at the same time. And there's a pretty good picture, if you can find it somewhere on the internet, of me with a whiskey and 2 hats.
All right. 2hats1mike. All right. For 2hats1mike, for producer Luke, for Jerry, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.